If you follow the geopolitical change, and particularly when we look at the nation of China, and the country constitute 1.4 billion people today, and surely there's no surprise that China today is facing a lot of challenges. And not only we're seeing this population decline, and also on this international sense, that people are very much anxious about the Chinese economy. Well, given the fact that today, post the pandemic, and we're still in this slow procedure to understand and how to encounter the unexpected changes at this moment. But meanwhile, when we look at China, we have to talk about this Belt and Road Initiative. It's one of the signatory projects under the Chinese leader. Despite the fact that some of the European countries and start to question this motivation behind BRI, but meanwhile, some of the countries among the Latin American region that start to understand that by building this collaboration with China and can be rather beneficial, and especially we'll look at this economic agenda. Take the country of Bolivia, for example. Here's a question. When was the last time that we talk about the nation of Bolivia? And given the fact that this nation today is facing rather what we called this economic turmoil. And now, without isolation and without being left out by the international community, and China, and that's right, China decided to step in and decided to support this country for a lot of or even more major projects. And of course, in return, this relationship is going to get better and much stronger. But how should we understand that? What is going on in the nation of Bolivia? And how do we understand this favor, or even this what we call the reciprocity between China and Bolivia at this moment? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, and who is Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he focuses on international law, international relations, and in Brazil, and he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Will.
Well, Dr. Marcus, again, you and I, we had the conversation regarding Belt and Road Initiative multiple times. But right now, I want to talk about the nation of Bolivia. As I mentioned before, when we look at the current political and also this economic situation in Bolivia, it's quite worrying. Now, let me read some statement to you, and also want to get your further explanation. Based on the research, and it says Bolivia today is facing one of the worst economic and financial crises in history. Again, when we look at the high inflation and also high unemployment rates, are also anxious at this moment. Now, help us with better understanding. Let's start with the fundamental question. What is happening to the nation of Bolivia? And also, what are the major factors that actually led to the high inflation and also the high unemployment rate at this moment?
Well, Bolivia is a country that has throughout history faced many challenges. It is certainly one of the poorest countries in Latin America, and has gone through some political turmoils many times. For a period of time, was very reliant on the United States. Even had a president that spoke Spanish with an American accent. And Bolivia has had challenging issues. It's a country that is landlocked. It lost access to the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean in a war, in the 19th century. And the country has never really recovered economically because of the geographic situation that it has, the fact that the population is uneducated, and that's a challenge that they face. And also the fact that somehow Bolivia is a country that has also had gone through the wave of bad politicians, right? Bad leadership that somehow has never really made the country move into a a higher level of development. Uh, and that is, I think, one of the greatest challenges that Bolivia has faced throughout time. And what you see now is the consequence of bad policies that they have had in the past. The fact that the population is not educated enough for the challenges of the 21st century. And the fact that, many countries, like many countries in the world, it's still facing the challenges and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And somehow, because of its past of not being able to overcome these challenges, faces difficulties in finding support in the traditional partners like the United States and the European Union or the IMF or the normal players in the market. So Bolivia has somehow found in China, because of its political regime that's a little bit more on the left, but has found in China a reliable source and a reliable partner in this very difficult transition moment. And considering that the regime in the political system in Bolivia somehow is a little opposed to the United States, then you do see that China comes as an answer to the prayers of the Bolivian people in order to address many of these challenges and somehow promote economic development by building the infrastructure that the country needs, but most importantly, allowing Bolivia to get back on track through investments, through the Belt and Road Initiative, and other possibilities. So Bolivia, which is a country that somehow is stuck in a difficult, challenging situation, does see China as a possibility to somehow be able to navigate these challenging times and perhaps find a new path for development and economic growth.
Dr. Marcus, again, I'm very glad that you touch on that China has actively provided assistance for Bolivia. Now, let's get something more specific. Now, based on the research that during the pandemic period, again, according to the facts, that China has been mobilizing quickly that come to Bolivia's aid and increase its clout in the region. And of course, that post the pandemic, China has also provided Bolivia with increasing sums of currency, which is the RMB. Now, it might come as a surprise for a lot of listeners and viewers that Bolivia today is now able to use the Chinese currency for any trade or even perhaps for any economic factors. Now, again, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, you're the expert. Help us with better understanding. What does that mean that when we say that countries such as Bolivia it's able to use the Chinese currency for economic relationship or for economic mutual benefits? What does that mean even for the bigger picture? Because again, some believe that the US has completely, the word is called deprioritized Bolivia and given the sour relations with the socialist led government in Bolivia. What do you say to that?
Now, well, there is an important movement that China has started and has been leading, which is not the replacement of the US dollar, but by building the RMB as an alternative to the dollar. Now, what happened is that we have gone through some difficult times. If you will recall, during the Asian financial crisis, in the last century, many countries realized that they could not count on the international organizations or the United States to be their lender of last resort, right? So you see that in Asia, for instance, Asian countries have tried to lower their dependence on the international financial institutions. Now, then you had the 2007 crisis, which was a crisis provoked by the United States that was extremely damaging to the whole world. And in 2008, you had the euro crisis. Now, at the time, many people thought about, not being able to rely on the dollar as a reserve currency. Because, the reason why the dollar is a reserve currency of the world is because the United States has somehow had an open economy. And, the dollar has not devalued as much. And we believe somehow that the U.S. government really tries its best to keep the dollar and keep the inflation low. So these are very important characteristics, and to keep dollar as the reserve value for the world. Now, it turned out that for a few years, people thought that somehow the euro would replace it. But the euro has had some major issues and challenges to address that it has not really resolved. One of them is the fiscal policy, which is not unified within the European Union. Only the fiscal policy through the European Central Bank. But, things need to change also in the fiscal policy. So the euro never stepped in to replace the dollar. And in 2007, with the crisis in the United States, it would be a natural movement for people to seek other currencies as their reserve, as their reserve currency or their reserve value. Now, what happened is that there was no alternative, really. So it was a crisis provoked by the United States that affected the dollar, right? It affected the currency, the dollar. And yet, people had no alternatives to the dollar but the dollar. Now, somehow, other countries have perceived that this is a challenging situation because somehow the United States has abused its power on the dollar. I'm not the first one to say that. I think there was a French minister who said that, the dollar was a privilege, an exorbitant privilege that the United States had, and it used in many circumstances to create problems for countries. So the U.S. has, weaponized the dollar, has weaponized the SWIFT system, and through sanctions, the U.S. has somehow created many challenges to many countries around the world. Now, with the Ukraine war, many governments in the world saw that the sanctions applied against Russia were kind of eye-opening because somehow if you had assets in dollars, they would be frozen immediately. And if you are any country in the world that has some reserved currencies and you have some reserves in U.S. dollars, you kind of feared the fact that somehow the U.S. could freeze your reserves just because they decided to impose sanctions on you. So the dollar has steadily been declining in its power. Of course, everybody preserves dollars, everybody likes dollars, everybody wants to keep dollars. But we do see that there is a movement towards this replacement. And certainly the RMB is the currency that is fighting in that process. Of course, the RMB still has a process that has some way to go to become as reliable as the dollar, right? Which is, a process of building trust in the currency. Now, what is the advantage that the RMB has? Well, first of all, China is the number one trading partner for more than 140 countries and territories around the world. So somehow, China already deals with everybody. So it makes sense in the long run for countries, instead of using the dollar in transactions with China, to use the RMB. And the next stage is for countries to start trading with each other using the RMBs that they have when buying and when selling products to China. So it's a natural movement that the Chinese have made the option to take a long-term perspective in this process of replacing the dollar, but not fully replacing right now, because we cannot forget that China holds major reserves in US dollars. So it wouldn't be crazy enough to destroy the value that it has in US dollars. But we do see that somehow the RMB is steadily changing that, becoming more and more relevant. It became one of the currencies of the reserve currencies of the International Monetary Fund, which is an important thing. The SPR, the SDR, right, the special drawing rights. So we do see that the RMB is steadily growing in that process. And of course, for Bolivia, a country that doesn't have access to dollars because it's not exporting anything in the process to the United States or to other countries, somehow China steps in, and China is allowing Bolivia to, receive RMBs. And it's good because somehow you lose the dependency that one might have on the U.S. because the United States is the only country that produces dollars in the world. I always tell my students, that there are only three ways for you to get the dollar, right? Number one is exporting, right? And then you get dollars. The other one is receiving investment from other countries. And it's a difficult thing because your country needs to be attractive and competitive to receive foreign currency. And third is by borrowing. And usually poor countries are the ones that have to pay the highest interest rates because they represent more risk. So in the case of Bolivia, you do see that somehow doing trade in RMBs allows it to have a network of 140 countries and territories that it can work with. And second, it reduces the dependence on the dollar and all the requirements and all the impositions that the United States might have from time to time. You see, look into Venezuela that's trying to export oil and all the challenges that they have to go through because of the sanctions imposed by the U.S. or Cuba or Russia or, even China. So you do see that this abuse, this weaponization of the U.S. dollar somehow is working against the dollar and particularly the trust that people had in the dollar. So Bolivia is an interesting aspect. Brazil is also trying to do that, negotiate and work with dollars instead of using dollars, using the RMBs in the transactions. And I think this is a new trend. And of course, it's a challenging thing because it's not easy to replace the dollar. The dollar has been around for many years. But I do see that building this alternative is something that somehow the world would like to see happening.
Dr. Marcus, let's talk about one of the major resources that embedded in the nation of Bolivia, which is lithium. Again, we're looking at this trading relationship. Of course, as you mentioned before, China today has now overtaken the U.S. as Bolivia's main trading partner. And meanwhile, that we're looking at one of the critical natural resources, which is lithium. Again, lithium, it's rather critical, especially we're looking at not only for this technological advancement, but also we're looking at this EV advancement as well. So I guess the question that I would like to ask, or we're very much interested is, as we mentioned before, Dr. Marcus, this relationship is based on the word what we called reciprocity. So by building the loans or by generously giving the loans to Bolivia, and we're looking at this rich resources in Bolivia, what does China get in return? And so in other words, it's not just about this financial relationship, but when it comes to natural resources, when it comes to really to advance the mutual interest, what is it for China today by helping in Bolivia, especially from the perspective of natural resources? Your thoughts?
It's interesting because we have to be careful, Will. When we talk about natural resources and the relationship that China has with many countries, not to portray China like the previous colonizers from Europe, right? China does have lots of natural resources, not as much as it would like to have, right? China does have access to other markets like African countries, Russia, which is a country that has lots of natural resources too. So there are many options around the world when it comes to certain things. Of course, one of the interesting aspects that China has made many investments is the issue of electric vehicles, right? And I always say this, it's an interesting thing that you observe. Well, usually when countries, it's easy for you not easy, but challenging for you to move from poor to a middle level country, right? For you to, if you're poor and you become middle class, it's a small leap. But for you to go from middle class to rich, it's a huge step. It's a huge leap. And the same thing for countries. And what usually happens is that many countries get stuck in the process in the middle, and they become middle class, and they are facing what we call the middle income trap, right? They cannot go beyond the $10,000 income per GDP per capita, right? And that's a challenge that countries have. And that's very difficult because you reach that point doing certain things. And for you to do, you need to do something different to move to the upper, ladder, right? And you have to recall here that famous statement that is attributed to Einstein. We do not know whether he really said that, but he used to say, people say that he mentioned once that it is insanity for you to think that you're going to obtain different results by mixing the same ingredients. So a country that wants to get out of the middle income trap needs to find different ways of doing things. And as your president in China says, you need to find disruptive industries. And of course, one of the disruptive industries that China has found is the electric vehicle, right? Where China has invested a lot, not only in electric vehicles, but also artificial intelligence. Now, why is this important? Well, for a few reasons. China is oil dependent. It's an oil dependent country and has been since the mid 90s. And of course, considering all the mass that you always have when you are addressing, oil issues and the challenges that you face in the Middle East, oil is always a complicated commodity to deal with because it's a political commodity many times. So China is not self-sufficient or doesn't have self-sufficiency when it comes to oil. And China also had a pollution problem, right? So electric vehicles somehow address that issue too. That's why China is building an enormous park of new nuclear energy power plants around the country that is going to, first of all, reduce the dependence on oil, but second, also reduce the pollution. And that's where electric vehicles step in. And, you walk around Beijing, you just see the number of electric cars. And of course, when we talk about electric vehicles or anything that is electric, lithium, that is the main element for batteries, is an essential element that China has to somehow, scratch around the world, find all the places where lithium is abundant and build partnerships with those countries. And of course, no country likes to be only a commodity exporter. And that's why I think China needs in that kind of situation to offer the famous win-win proposition to countries in which, somehow Bolivians feel that they're not only selling their lithium, but they're getting something back as a result of industrialization or an improvement in their structure or in their infrastructure. So Bolivia is an important player because it has lithium. Lithium is certainly one of the most important items when it comes to batteries, and the 21st century is the century of electric vehicles, more issues, more products that use batteries, and lithium certainly is. What lithium is to the industry now, what oil was, for instance, in the early 20th century, right? So that's why you have to scoop around the world, find the places that have this, and somehow ensure that these countries are able to develop and not feel that they're just being exploited in that sense. So that is a challenge that China has, but I think that one of the positive aspects that China also presents to these countries is that China does have a development model that, if they not be completely applied to countries, somehow there are many principles that these countries could actually copy and paste to move their economies to a new level. And certainly one of the issues that I think that China does tell and that countries should follow is that, you should find your disruptive industries. And that's something that, for instance, Bolivia could think as a result of this relationship with China.
Dr. Marquez, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, I'm sure you follow the news closely that recently the sitting U.S. President Joe Biden attended one of the critical events, which is the G7 summit. I mean, again, this is not the first time that we're seeing the 7 leaders of the 7 countries that got together. Now, you mentioned regarding the war in Ukraine briefly, but again, based on the report and based on the National Security Advisor that said to the press, the 7 countries has recommitted to this package, this powerful financial package worth about $50 billion that to support Ukraine in order to win the war over Russia. Now, with that said, we're looking at this political polarization in the U.S. and also some of the countries in Europe as well. So, given the fact that we're looking at the interest also between U.S. and also some of the Latin American regions, so how much do we believe the U.S. today has completely shifted its attention away from this Latin American region, but instead is focusing on building more allies or, regaining the trust like the partners among the 7 countries or even the 6 countries, and so that it could leave much greater opportunities for China? How much do we believe such statement or even believe what's happening today? Your final thoughts.
Well, a few things. Well, I was just looking at the table of the G7 meeting, and the 7 countries plus the European Union, and I just realized that 5 of them will be gone very soon. Right? 5 of those leaders will be gone soon, depending on the election. So, and the G7, it was like, when I looked at the table, that sounded more like an afternoon tea than anything else, right? I wasn't looking and saying, well, big decisions are being made out of this meeting. And the answer is no, right? The world and the big decisions now are made in Beijing, or they're made, by BRICS countries, and including Russia. And it's an interesting thing because it is a group that says that it's trying to seek peace, but never invites Russia to discuss anything. And most of this money will never reach Ukraine, as we know, right? Those are amounts that are announced, but they are going to be used in the developing of the military domestically. And it's a good way to boost the economy and anything like that. But the issue is that it's not really going to change the situation in Ukraine, because first of all, and that's sad to say, Ukraine embarked in a war that it's very unlikely to win. Because if you realize what is the purpose of NATO, and the great mistake of the US is that somehow the United States wanted to landlock Russia when it comes to access to the Mediterranean, right? And of course, any political leader in Russia, no matter whether, he was that leader would be pro United States or pro West or against the West, no leader would ever allow that to happen, right? It's as if, Mexico decided to turn against the U.S. and become an ally of China, right? How would the United States react? Or if, Cuba started receiving weaponry from China, so how would the U.S. react? So I think Ukraine is doing a bad, has been placed in a tough spot because it is fighting a proxy war between the United States, Russia, and China, right? It is unlikely to win. It will suffer a major demographic problem because, lots of men are dying. It will take many, many years to recover economically. Though the United States is saying that they're going to use the Russian funds that have been frozen. It may not be enough, right, to rebuild the country. And finally, I think that the recent elections to the European Parliament, where you saw, people are saying, oh, the ascension of the extreme right, but I'm not saying that it's the ascension of the extreme right. It is the ascension of a political group that somehow has realized that the war in Ukraine has been having a major toll in the lives of Europeans. Because if you look into Europe, inflation is high, prosperity is down, the perspectives for economic growth are very, very low. And really, Europe is becoming a place of, dead dreams, right? Which is bad because somehow for many, many centuries, Europe was at the forefront of many of the innovations that we saw in the world. But now it's becoming an old continent with, few ideas and somehow becoming poor and old, which is challenging. And so when I see these leaders saying that they should continue the war in Ukraine, I do really have my doubts whether, first of all, they have the best interests of, the Ukrainians in their hearts and in their minds. And second, whether they have the best interests of their own population by carrying on this war that is not going to go anywhere.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, I agree with you 100%. I mean, we are seeing this unprecedented political changes, especially you mentioned that we're looking at this election took place in the European parliamentary, and also we're looking at this polarization in the US and of course in some of the major countries. We don't even know what will happen to the war, and we don't even know what's going to happen to the political climate in the US. But one thing we do know that China is bold enough to take initiatives and help the countries, that it's not just about the word reciprocity, but again, in return, it's about building this positive and healthful image and continue to spread and share the positivity for the greater future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at Policy Center for the New South, and he focuses on international law and international relations. Well, Dr. Marcus, it's always been a pleasure, and thank you so much for your time, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to discover the matters around the world, and thank you so much for doing this.